Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I will be discussing events of the first half of the 9th century until 850. Similar to last times, I will mainly focus on accounts in which the Kurds are explicitly mentioned and, by and large, won't incorporate the allusions to Kurds in today's Luri-speaking areas. More and more, in this century there are individuals and movements in the Kurdish areas that deserve to be discussed in greater detail, but which I won't treat in this video. Another thing I have to note is that for some of the events in this video there are a plethora of sources which cite widely divergent figures and sometimes even dates. I do not have the time to go over all of these. Finally, I will be discussing a figure called Nasser. For a long time it was believed that he was one and the same as Theophilos. However, in a book of 2010 called The Emperor Theophilos and the East 829 until 842 by Kurdanai, it has been convincingly argued that they were, most likely, two different persons. Theophilos won't be discussed in this video. So, let's start. For the first 2 decades there's not that much I could find, except for the start of Babak's rebellion, I'll get to that in a bit, and perhaps for Abu Dulaf, who ruled at Jabal from the early 9th century until the 30s. Ibn Khalikan, in an undated segment, states, Abu Dulaf, having encountered some Kurds who were intercepting travelers in the province under his rule, struck one camel rider through with his lance, and the point entered into the body of another, who was sitting behind him. He thus killed them both at a stroke. First, I may briefly point to the further rise and fall of the Sadakia family I mentioned in my previous video. Though not specified to be Kurdish as far as I know in the sources, they did rule in the northern Zagros area. Sadaka II was even assigned to rule Armenia and Azerbaijan by the Caliph Mamun, if he would fight the Khurramidin leader Babak. He briefly did so, but then captured Mosul from Said ibn Yunus Azdi, which angered Mamun, whereupon he sent an army, and Sadaka II was killed in 827 or 8. The Choramites or Horamdinan were a movement mingling Islam and Zoroastrianism, often seen as a pro-Iranic movement against Arab domination, which evolved after the death of Abu Muslim, and their first rebellion happened in the second half of the 8th century by one Sunbat, perhaps of a Parthian noble background, who mostly relied on men from the Jabal. The 9th century Yaqubi, when discussing regions now mostly Luri-speaking, mentions two towns called Al-Qamidan and Fahman, saying they were peopled by Kurds and Khoramia. In any case, for about the year 829 we have a remarkable account of a rising of Kurds in Bedkardwaye, called Kurdanai in two sources. That the Kurdanai were Kurds is confirmed by Michael the Syrian, who says that they were of Kurdish race and had a separate language. The Kurdanai were called both Magi and pagans. They rebelled because of the appearance of a king, a long-expected Mahdi, his coming predicted by an oracle. This Mahdi veiled himself and called himself Christ and the Holy Ghost, and was to lead his followers to God. His kingdom would be handed over to another person, and it would have no end. His believers would resurrect 40 days after their death, go to their folks, and then move to an unknown place. I might add that this has some similarity with Alevi Kurdish beliefs, which will be discussed in the future. He fortified a camp in Bedkardwaye. His worship spread into the Jazira and Armenia, and many from different nations gathered around him with the intention of plundering. His worshippers regarded all others as alien. They devastated Beth Zabdai and Turabdin and killed at will. Mamun, becoming fearful, sent the commander Hassan, who beat the Mahdi in Turabdin, who was plundering the monastery of Kartamin. The Mahdi fled to the country of Isaac, son of Ashot, the Armenian, but the latter caught him, detained him in his house, beheaded him, took his money and fled. The Kurdanai enters his house, but only found the Mahdi's corpse. After a while, when Isaac had exited his fortress to fight the Tayaya Arabs, the Kurdanai then besieged the fortress and killed some people with stones. But the Christians found shelter, prayed for salvation, and the Kurdanai's chief was killed by a spear-bearing monk. The people inside the fortress, however, despaired ever more, and Isaac's wife even was ready to die on the battlefield herself. But Kurdanai, in time, turned back, fatigued from besieging the fortress, and Isaac arrived on time to combat them. The Kurdanai, impeded by the snow, were slain. Some escaped and set up a new leader called Harun, killed by another commander named Ali ibn Hisham. Thereafter, their leader was said to be Babak. Also, a large number of them fled to Theophilos, the Byzantine king, and offered him their subjugation in 830. When Babak was killed, the remaining Kurdanai are said to have become Muslims. You might also remember Thomas of Marga's Book of Governors of the previous video. He had gone to Beth Abbeh in 832 and witnessed the Kurds' plundering of the temple when it was ruled by one Joseph. They carried off everything of value. In 833 there was a Khurramite rising in Jebal, led by one Ali, son of Mazdak, and his brother. I won't go into detail since the Kurds are not explicitly mentioned, but this is of course a known Kurdish region. The Jebal, already known to us, is called by Yaqubi the home of the hard-hearted Kurds. When the rising was quelled by the commander Ishak, who killed anywhere between 5,000 to 60,000 of the Khurramites in Hamadan, making others prisoners, a large number of the Choramides fled via Armenia to the Byzantine Empire, where they arrived in 834 and entered in the service of Emperor Theophilos. They married the widows of fallen soldiers and they were made into a military corps. Now let's take a look at Babak's Horamdinan revolt. He was from a village near Ardabil, allegedly of noble descent as well. His revolt had already started in 816 when he took over the leadership of the Horamdinan in the region. His allies ruled quite a bit west of him, and Masudi even claims he ruled across the Aras into Aran, yet the veracity of this is disputed. Note, Babak is not called Kurdish. One of his allies and senior commanders was Isma, called al-Kurdi by Yaqubi, who was the indigenous lord of Marand, a town north of Lake Urmia. He was to be betrayed by Babak's other ally, Ibn al-Ba'ith, an Arab, holder of a fortress called Shahi, on an island in Lake Urmia, as well as of Tabriz, and who had married Isma al-Kurdi's daughter, to strengthen his influence in the region. This treason happened either in 834 or 5. This came about because Isma al-Kurdi, when sent on a raid, halted by Ibn al-Ba'ith, who welcomed him in his fortress with his personal guard, but then killed his retinue and, one by one, called up his followers to kill them. Until the rest realized what was going on and fled, the captured Isma was sent to al-Mutasim, who interrogated him on the territory, and Isma provided him with information on the roads and possible methods of warfare. He remained in captivity until the reign of al-Wataq. Another of Babak's followers, according to Michael the Syrian, was the aforementioned Nasser Kurdanai, who, however, seems to have fled to the Byzantine Empire before Babak's final demise, perhaps in 834. More on him at the end of the video. Babak suffered further defeats at the hands of the commander Afshin, and this rebellion ended in 837 when the new Caliph Mamun sent new reinforcements. Babak tried to flee through Armenia, thinking of going on to the Byzantine Empire, but he was handed over by Sal Sambatian, the Armenian prince of Aran and Shaki, who, however, had promised him safety. He and his brother were executed after being delivered to the Caliph in 838. The 9th century Dinawari notes an interesting detail. When Babak fled towards Armenia, Sal ibn Sunbat hurried to intercept him, for Afshin had already asked the rulers of these regions, the Kurds of Armenia and the Bitlys, to close the roads on Babak. In the year 838, a Kurdish leader by the name of Jafar ibn Fahirjes or Mirijes rebelled, commanding many Kurds, master of the country between Mosul, Azerbaijan and Armenia. He intercepted communication and had many assassinated. In any case, Muttasim sent Abdullah al-Azdi to Mosul, who fought Jafar at a place called Manis. The latter was beaten and fled. Jafar went to the forbidding Dasna mountain. Abdullah pursued him and battled him again, but was beaten by Jafar and the Kurds, who were more numerous and knew the place well. Many of Abdullah's men were killed, but through the efforts of one Rabo, who managed to break the Kurdish ranks and keep them busy, some managed to escape. Rabo then jumped from the mountain onto his horse, and then together they jumped in the river below, saving themselves. Among those that Jafar had captured were two men by names of Ismail and Ishak ibn Anas. Ishak was the uncle of Abdullah and, interestingly, the father-in-law of Jafar. Ismail therefore thought that he would spare Ishak and entrusted his children to him. However, Ishak assured him this would not happen and asked Jafar to kill him before killing Ismail. Jafar complied, first killing Ishak, then Ismail. When Muttasim heard of this news, he ordered the commander Itah to go to Jafar and combat him. He did so in 839, 40 or 41, going to the same mountain which lay on the road of Suk al-Ahad. Jafar went to meet him and a grave battle ensued, but Jafar was killed. His comrades dispersed and his misdoings on the people were lifted. It is also said that Jafar drank poison and died, and only thereafter Itah attacked the Kurds, killing some, plundering them and deporting the captured ones to Tikrit. In 842 there was yet another Kurdish rebellion, also recorded by both Hebraeus and Michael the Syrian. It was led by one Mushe or Musa, chief of the Kurdaye in the country of Kardu. The ensuing occupation during winter of the local population's houses by the Abbasid army, called Persians, led to prices skyrocketing for salt, cheese, and walnuts, while before Kardu used to export the latter too. The Kurds managed to kill about 15,000 of the so-called Persians because they did not go out to fight until they were well rested, refreshed, and had eaten and drunk enough, while the Persians suffered from severe cold and their fingers and toes were frostbitten. Thereafter, it is said that there came a severe famine and a terrible pestilence, and there was tribulation through the heaviness of the imposts and through the rebels. For the men of Dara and Nisibis and Ahmadiyya used to come out in bands and plunder, and the Persians attacked them and destroyed them. And because they did not kill the Christians, many Arabs saved themselves by using the sign of the cross. It's possible that here Arab quite simply refers to Muslims. In 845 or 6, Tabari notes Wasif the Turk arrived from the area of Isbahan, Al-Jabal and Fars. He had gone in pursuit of the Kurds, for they had been trying to infiltrate into these areas. About 500 of the Kurds came with him, including young slaves bound together in chains and fetters. Wasif ordered that they be imprisoned. It can also be assumed that somewhere in the middle of the 9th century, the Bashnawi Kurds took the fortress of Fanak. As for the year 1145, Hebraeus states that they had held it for 300 years. Now let's focus on Nasser Kurdanai. He, as said earlier, had fled into the Byzantine Empire, perhaps in 834. He functioned as the commander of the Choramites in a few battles, a lead seal of the first half of the 9th century, perhaps to be read as Al-Nasr, may be attributed to him. It reads, to the imperial Spatharios and Turmarkes of the Foederatoi, meaning he was a military commander of a people, allied to the Byzantines. The Khurramites are mentioned in the Byzantine expeditions to Armenia in the 830s. Nasser was active in the battle for Sapetra, aka Sosopetra, in 837. In this barely defended city, the Byzantine forces plundered many goods, killed many of the men, kidnapped women and children, and thereafter burned the city down. The Choramites had a great hand in these atrocities. This outraged the Caliph, who sent generals in 838 to relieve the city. They found the emperor had already retreated. Further preparations were made to thrust into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The Caliphal army in the same year would attack Anzan, Ankara, and Amorium. In Anzan, the Byzantine king got separated from the main body of the army, which fled as they thought the emperor had gotten killed. He was protected and saved by Nasser and the Choramites. Among the latter, Masudi said to be refugees from both Azerbaijan and Jebel. In any case, the Muslims triumphed over the Byzantines, and particularly the sack of Amorium was terrible. It may also be remarked that the historian Skylitzis in one battle notes 10,000 Kurds in the army of Al-Mutassim as well, but this may be an error since in the subsequent battle he notes Turkish archers instead, and Al-Mutassim was indeed mostly noted for his Turkic slave soldiers. Note, however, that according to Arabic popular medieval literature, Al-Mutassim had Kurdish soldiers as well. The Byzantine emperor blamed himself, seeing this as a result of the destruction of Zobatra. Apparently, he wanted to deliver the captives, hand over the ones guilty of the atrocities, and reconstruct the city of Zobatra on his own expenses. To sue for peace. He sent the patrician Basilios with 2 letters, one positive, to be handed along with gifts, the other negative if Mutassim refused. For Mutassim, the offer was not enough. He also wanted Nasser Kurdanai, Nasser's son, and Emmanuel to be handed over to him, which was refused. Nasser's son may have been Theophilos, by the way. Then Mutassim got the second letter, which enraged him, and he sent Abu Sa'id, Bashir, and the Sons of the Desert to make raids in different directions. This was probably in 839, and in the region of Cilicia. Bashir managed to acquire booty and take captives. However, Nasser managed to catch up with him and free the captives. With the arrival of Abu Sa'id, Nasser weakened and Bashir killed and beheaded him. Nasser's followers then witnessed death before their eyes. They dismounted and fought on foot until all of them died. They were beheaded and brought to Mopsuestia or Masisa, where the wives of the Kurds recognized them and greatly lamented. Note that Hebraeus does not speak of Masisa, but of the desert. For this century, a Kurdish scholar in Baghdad is also mentioned. He was a student of Ahmad bin Hanbali, who lived from 780 to 855. In his book of Kurdish greats, Baba Merdukh Ruhani mentions several other scholars for this century as well, such as Bassam Kurdi, who died in 873 and was one of the first Persian language poets after the coming of Islam. One event that probably was somewhere in between reality and legends is the founding of the Roshki dynasty of Bitlys. In the future I will go in greater detail. In any case, the writer Sharafkhan, who completed his work in 1597, says that his dynasty had existed for 760 years, which would mean it was founded in 837. What would become the Oroshki tribal confederation one day gathered at Top, in the region of Khwet. It consisted of 24 clans in total, 5 of which were old tribes in that region. The others constituted 2 big groups, Bilbasi and Qawalisi. They chose a leader and then captured Bitlys and Huzul from a Georgian king named David. Thereafter, their leader died and left no offspring. As such, they went to 2 brothers of Sassanid descent who resided in Khalat, Izzadin and Diyadin, and they were elected to rule over them. The lineage of Diyadin would preside over Bitlys and its surroundings, and the lineage of Izzadin over Huzul and Sassoum. 4 old tribes in the lost region are mentioned, and they were complemented by tribes mostly coming from Hassan Cave. On to the conclusion. The Kurds in the first half of the 9th century were involved in many risings. We have seen how struggles to retain their original Iranic beliefs, faced with Arab domination at this time, led to many terrible battles. Though they were often suppressed, the frequency of the risings can only indicate that these beliefs were still very current in many different Kurdish inhabited regions. It also appears that we see an expansion of the regions in which Kurds were mentioned, to a degree no doubt to be attributed to Kurds and other Iranics fleeing west into the Byzantine Empire, in which they would serve and where some would convert to Christianity. We have also seen a few more prominent named Kurdish individuals, holding some power over their regions. This would only increase in the late 9th century as Arab domination would further crumble, and the Iranic peoples evermore would reassert themselves as masters of their countries. Please look forward to my next video, the Kurds in the second half of the 9th century. For the sources, check the description. Thank you very much.